Stiglitz is a Nobel Prize-winning economist and Columbia University professor, and he's pushing for a rethinking of the global economic framework in the wake of a financial crisis. Now, he's come with other economic and policy leaders to the historic Bretton Woods, where decades ago a conference here led to the formation of the International Monetary Fund and named the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency. And they've gathered to rethink some of those very policies. He joins us now to tell us more about it. I want to thank you so much for joining us, Professor. Now, you've written recently about the increase in disparity between rich and poor in the United States, and you've even compared these conditions to what led to the unrest we've seen in the Middle East. So what do you think are the factors that led to this, and what do you think the consequences will be?
Well, the point that I raised was the increase in the concentration of income and wealth in the United States has been enormous. What's happened in the last couple of decades is almost a quarter of all the income goes to the upper 1%. Around 40%, depending on how you measure it, of the wealth goes to the upper 1%. Americans used to think of themselves as a land of opportunity. Everybody else thinks of themselves as a land of opportunity, and they think of old Europe as ossified. The data don't show that.
Meanwhile, we see protests taking to the capitals of states like Wisconsin. So is this reaching a tipping point?
I think they're beginning to realize that most Americans are worse off than they were, say, a decade ago. So it's not just that all this wealth is going to the top. If everybody were getting better off, you could say, well, some are doing a little bit better than the others. But actually, most Americans are worse off than they were a decade ago. And that doesn't even include the sense of insecurity, the loss of jobs, the insecurity about health, rights that most people in Europe take for granted. In the United States, people, if they lose their job, can lose all access to health care. Now, one of the things that I raised in my article was that not only the political consequences, but the economic consequences, that there are many things that any society has to do together. You have to education, investments in technology, infrastructure, roads. That means there has to be a certain degree of consensus for a society to function, even economically. These are things that government has to do. But if you have a very split society, there are going to be very different views about what's important. If the rich can buy their own parks, they don't need to have public parks. If the rich can buy their own education, we don't have to have public education. If the rich can buy their own health care, we don't have to have good health care for most Americans. And that's where we're winding up today. So the people at the top, that 1%, are using their political power to try to preserve their wealth, and meanwhile making sure that the government doesn't do what is necessary for the prosperity, the functioning of our entire society.
We're not seeing an increase in funding for infrastructure or education or science. Instead, we're seeing quite the opposite. So do you think this country is headed in the wrong direction?
That's right. And that was what was brought home so forcefully by what was happening in Wisconsin. Here you have people saying all over the country, we need to improve education. But what are they doing? Cutting teacher salaries. Now, you're not going to attract the best people into education if you don't pay them. I mean, that's simple economics. And it's not a surprise in that context that today, in those standardized scores that rate education all over the world, the United States is really not doing very well.
So who's to blame here? Is it politicians asleep at the wheel who are out of touch with reality, or are there greater